Basic survival instinct.
They tell us they have feelings, their parents tell us they have feelings. This is another place in which I think our current research shows that the previous understanding of autism was wrong.
At UCLA.
Good one, right? Super old, but everything they talk about still holds true. So, which is interesting, the disorder has not changed over time. You still see that with a lot of kids. Not every kid, but a lot of them. So, autism spectrum disorder, as really a very nice synopsis, is a developmental disability that is defined by its symptoms. It's defined by what you can see. So the symptoms can be characterized by behavioral excesses, which are things that shouldn't be there that are. They're extra things that have developed that a typically developing child, seemingly typically developing child, would not develop. Behavioral deficits are things that should have developed over time that didn't. So what causes autism? We don't know. We still don't know. Most likely, recent research, which research is ongoing, it has come a long way in the last few years, is most likely genetics with some sort of environmental interaction. So we're going to watch a video in just a second, which is absolutely amazing. We can't watch the whole thing because it's a little bit long, but it's a really good summary of some of the research that's happening recently. It's a little bit older too. There are still some things that maybe are increasing the risk of having autism. There's no known cause, but they're looking at risk factors. Two other ones are advanced paternal age. There is a higher likelihood if the father of a child is older when they have a child, that there is an increased risk that that child will be diagnosed eventually. Also, infections when the child is in utero also could potentially increase the risk. There's also some medications that they're looking at. One specifically that if taken when a woman is pregnant, a certain seizure medication also is something that they have been able to link to an increased risk. Two things that are definitely not a cause and have been 100% disproven is something called the cold mother myth. This is an old theory where if the child wasn't held or loved as much by their mother than they should have been, that then they would develop autism. And then vaccines, which is a hot button topic, but the video that we're going to watch, I think summarizes it pretty beautifully. Vaccines do not cause autism. So a couple of things about genetics really quick. ASD runs in families. But as when we watch the video, you will want to note that it's not that there's a higher risk if one child in the family already has autism, then there's another child born, there's a higher risk that that second child will be diagnosed with autism, especially if the second child is a boy. Significantly higher risk. However, autism can start in families. And that's one of the things that the video will talk about a little bit, is that this is not something that's passed down generation to generation. It can begin now and then start to become a genetic cause. Yeah?
I have a quick question about the paternal age.
Oh, yeah.
Do they know, what are they saying is the older age? Is that like 30, 40, 50?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it increases as the person gets older. I would guess it mimics maternal age. So above, what is it now, 35? So I would guess as it goes up from there. I don't think that they talk about it in the video, and I haven't been able to find an exact number, but I would guess when you get up in 40s and definitely 50s, it would be significant. Yeah, yeah. It would be interesting to see if we can figure that out, though. So there is something about ASD that's inheritable, but what is it? It's likely that there's significantly more than one gene that's interacting that is causing autism to develop. Also, what has been a long time theory that they're trying to figure out what it is that genetics most likely only predisposes a person to autism, and it's something in the environment that they're interacting with that then brings autism out. So, which is really interesting, because how do you figure that part out? I'm not sure. Genetics is what they're working on right now. I've not heard of any studies about environmental other than ruling things out, like chemicals and things like that. Things would maybe increase the risk, but not necessarily be linked as a causal factor. So I love this video. I highly, highly, highly encourage you to watch the whole thing. Just Google Autism TED Talks and find Wendy Chung. We're gonna watch a good chunk of it. It's about 15 minutes, but we're gonna only listen to about 5 or 6 minutes of it. It's a really good one.
Result of that, more individuals were diagnosed and got access to the resources they needed. In addition, we've changed our definition over time. And so in fact, we've widened the definition of autism, and that accounts for some of the increased prevalence that we see. The next question everyone wonders is, what caused autism? And a common misconception is that vaccines cause autism. But let me be very clear. Vaccines do not cause autism. In fact, the original research study that suggested that was the case was completely fraudulent. It was actually retracted from the journal Lancet in which it was published, and that author, a physician, had his medical license taken away from him. The Institutes of Medicine, the Centers for Disease Control, have repeatedly investigated this, and there is no credible evidence that vaccines cause autism. Furthermore, one of the ingredients in vaccines, something called thimerosal, was thought to be what the cause of autism was. That was actually removed from vaccines in the year 1992, and you can see that it really did not have an effect in what happens with the prevalence of autism. So again, there is no evidence that this is the answer. So the question remains, what does cause autism? In fact, there's probably not one single answer. Just as autism is a spectrum, there's a spectrum of etiologies, a spectrum of causes. Based on epidemiological data, we know that one of the causes, or one of the associations, I should say, is advanced paternal age. That is, increasing age of the father at the time of conception. In addition, another vulnerable and critical period in terms of development is when the mother's pregnant. During that period, while the fetal brain is developing, we know that exposure to certain agents can actually increase the risk of autism. In particular, there's a medication, valproic acid, which mothers with epilepsy sometimes take, we know can increase that risk of autism. In addition, there can be some infectious agents that can also cause autism. And one of the things I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on are the genes that can cause autism. I'm focusing on this not because genes are the only cause of autism, but it's a cause of autism that we can readily define and be able to better understand the biology and understand better how the brain works so that we can come up with strategies to be able to intervene. One of the genetic factors that we don't understand, however, is the difference that we see in terms of males and females. Males are affected 4-to-1 compared to females with autism, and we really don't understand what that causes. One of the ways that we can understand that genetics is a factor is by looking at something called the concordance rate. In other words, if one sibling has autism, what's the probability that another sibling in that family will have autism? And we can look in particular at 3 types of siblings. Identical twins, twins that actually share 100% of their genetic information and share the same intrauterine environment, versus fraternal twins, twins that actually share 50% of their genetic information, versus regular siblings, brothers, sisters, sisters, also sharing 50% of their genetic information, yet not sharing the same intrauterine environment. And when you look at those concordance ratios, one of the striking things that you will see is that in identical twins, that concordance rate is 77%. Remarkably though, it's not 100%. It is not that genes account for all of the risk for autism, but yet they account for a lot of that risk because when you look at fraternal twins, that concordance rate is only 31%. On the other hand, there is a difference between those fraternal twins and the siblings, suggesting that there are common exposures for those fraternal twins that may not be shared as commonly with siblings alone. So this provides some of the data that autism is genetic. Well, how genetic is it? When we compare it to other conditions that we're familiar with, things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, in fact, genetics plays a much larger role in autism than it does in any of these other conditions. But with this, that doesn't tell us what the genes are. It doesn't even tell us in any one child, is it one gene or potentially a combination of genes? And so in fact, in some individuals with autism, it is genetic. That is, that it is one single, powerful, deterministic gene that causes the autism. However, in other individuals, it's genetic. That is, that it's actually a combination of genes, in part with the developmental process that ultimately determines that risk for autism. We don't know in any one person necessarily which of those 2 answers it is until we start digging deeper. So the question becomes, how can we start to identify what exactly those genes are? And let me pose something that might not be intuitive. In certain individuals, they can have autism for a reason that is genetic, but yet not because of autism running in the family. And the reason is because in certain individuals, they can actually have genetic changes or mutations that are not passed down from the mother or from the father, but actually start brand new in them. Mutations that are present in the egg or the sperm at the time of conception that have not been passed down generation through generation within the family. And we can actually use that strategy to now understand and to identify those genes causing autism in those individuals. So in fact, at the Simons Foundation, we took 2,600 individuals that had no family history of autism.
I'm going to stop it there. It's very interesting, and I'd love to be able to show all of it, but it's pretty long. So I would encourage you to watch it if you're interested, especially even the beginning. She talks about just the prevalence of autism and the increase and things like that. So things we've already talked about. So let's stop there for a second and talk a little bit about, we talked about the different areas of autism that in order to get a diagnosis, but what does that mean? So social communication deficits, social interaction deficits, and repetitive restrictive behavior. That's probably some of the areas that you would see the most because you have to have the deficits in those areas or excesses in those areas in order to qualify for autism. But what are some things that if you have someone in your family that has autism or you've worked with people with autism, what are some things that you see from them in those categories or just those qualities, how would you describe it? Just throw stuff out. You don't have to raise your hand.
Repeatedly looking at the clock, wanting to know what time it is.
Repetitive behavior. Yeah, so a specific repetitive behavior that Carol brought up is looking at the clock all the time.
Humming or eating.
Some vocal, we call it stereotypy now, so you might hear me say that, vocal stereotypy.
Flapping.
Clapping, yeah.
Sensitivity to noise.
Sensitivity to noise, that's a good one. What else? What'd you say?
Stemming.
Yes, yep, stimming. Yeah, using objects. So you guys are talking a really good amount about the excesses, the things that are extra that shouldn't be there. What about the things that didn't develop normally that should have? Eye contact.
Speech.
Not
Speech.
responding to greetings or conversation.
Yep, social interaction, so those perceived things where we respond to people when they greet us. Some of those social etiquette things that we do. What else? Anything? Empathy, that's a great one. Yep. What about in little dudes? What are some of the things that you see in little girls and boys that are diagnosed, toddlers and little school-aged kids? Because some of those things aren't expectations yet for them.
They don't
Play.
with toys, or they don't play.
Yes, deficits in play. Maybe they use the toys in a way that we would consider not the way the toy is used for. And that might be part of repetitive behavior. Yeah, their interests might be a little bit different than what you would think. They're not playing with shape sorters and ring stackers and trucks.
Self-harm behaviors.
What'd you say? I'm sorry.
Self-harm behaviors.
Self-harm behaviors, yep, self-injurious behavior. Yeah.
And like an extensive knowledge, like one particular area, like dinosaurs or trains.
Yes, yes. Some pretty preferred interests, prescribed interests. And in little kids, oftentimes you observe that in play. And then as they get older, sometimes you observe that in conversation. Yeah. And then that's where the spectrum comes in. So I work with all age ranges. And I have little kids and have had little kids that you start maybe a little bit higher skilled coming in that have really great play skills. But then you look a little further and they have really great play skills because they're playing with their prescribed interest. They're playing with dinosaurs, or they're playing with boats or planes or something like that. And as they get older, sometimes you see that develop into something different. It's not about playing with those things anymore. It's about talking about those things or researching those things, or only want to interact with those topics or interests during school. Instead of doing math, I'd rather be Googling planes and trains or whatever my interest is. Because I'm not interested in math, I'm interested in this topic. So sometimes it starts to look different, and sometimes those kids that have prescribed interests that start in play or are in conversation, those change a lot. So sometimes it might be dinosaurs, and then all of a sudden it's planes. Anything else?
Either they either overreact to like certain situations, like something that's scary, or they don't react enough.
Right. So overreaction to a situation or underreaction, yep. And then Carol said tantrums, so some sort of inappropriate behavior too. Yeah.
Lack of safety, like understanding.
Yeah, safety skill deficits, daily living skill deficits, yes, community participation, maybe lack of interest in peers or in socially appropriate activities or age appropriate activities. Yeah, it can look different, definitely, for each age range as well as each individual person. Good. Okay, so treatment. We're just going to touch on this really briefly, and I can answer a few questions about everything and then about treatment if you guys have more questions about it. But the biggest thing about treatment is that early diagnosis is critical. Early intervention is the most critical thing with autism. That's really great that now we are seeing kids earlier, even if down the road the 18-month-old ends up not actually having autism and maybe just has a speech delay. It's still really good that they access services at 18 months. So there are, one of the things that Wendy Chung talks about in her TED Talk later is that the different things that they are doing to try to screen kids for autism earlier, especially siblings. They're really looking at how, if one child already has autism, can we find biomarkers for the next child to see if we can get them intervention much earlier